Hello and welcome to Chasing Leviathan. I'm your host, PJ Weary, and I'm here today with Dr. Iain Thomson, professor of philosophy at the University of New Mexico. And we're here to talk about his book, Heidegger, on technology's danger and promise in the age of AI. Dr. Thomson, wonderful to have you on today.
Thanks, PJ. Glad to be here.
So, Dr. Thomson, tell me, immediately AI is one of those algorithm buzzwords, but why this book? Why did you feel, it's nice, kind of pithy, like from the Cambridge Elements? Why did you feel the need to write this book?
Yeah, good question. So I've been working on Heidegger and technology since last century. It was a big part of my PhD dissertation back in the day. And so in 2005, I brought out a book called Heidegger on Ontotheology, and the subtitle is Technology and the Politics of Education. So I was already thinking a lot about the way technology is transforming our understanding and practice of education, especially higher education, which is the field I work in. And I also was a student of Hubert Dreyfus at Berkeley, and he was a pretty famous critic of AI. That's how he ended up at Berkeley. It's not like Berkeley decided they needed a Heidegger scholar. It's more they decided they needed the David who slew the Goliath of AI at MIT. So he had that kind of legacy of being a critic of AI, and all of us who came up as his students were, immersed in that pretty deeply. So for me, it was really interesting to see the breakthroughs that we had with deep learning in AI and self-driving cars, which in a lot of ways seemed like things that should not have been able to happen, given the Dreyfus critique. So I found that very provocative and wanted to go back to Heidegger and kind of think through all of that. Part of my stuff on Heidegger and education is that the teacher isn't a know-it-all. They're the person who helps people learn how to learn by learning in public. So by showing our own learning, in both senses, we help other people learn to learn. And learning about the latest developments in AI, but also in fields like genetic engineering was part of what was involved in writing this book. The first half of it's sort of an examination of what it is about technological developments that make people anxious and worried, which is where Heidegger's own critique started from, and what they are today. He was thinking about atomic weapons, which are big here in New Mexico still, unfortunately. But so there's some on atomic weapons, and then interesting ways in which AI development echoes and reflects some of the historical developments we've seen in atomic weapons.
Yeah. And forgive me, I know this is probably an elementary question, but especially with Heidegger, elementary questions often become complex very quickly. When you say technology and you're using Heidegger's definition of technology, can you talk about what he means by technology? Because especially at a popular level, it just means anything with electronics, but then you start examining that definition, it doesn't work. So tell us a little bit about when you say technology, what do you mean? And what does Heidegger mean?
As you said, the elementary questions are actually the deep, difficult ones. Alexander Nahum Moss used to make a joke about never agree to fight a guy named Tiny. So when somebody says, I just have a little question. I just have a small question. That's when you need to get worried. And
no, hey, we only got, it's only an hour, right?
Yeah. So the most difficult part of the book, I don't know about reading it, but to understand in Heidegger is what he means by the essence of technology. So his view is that you can't understand technology by understanding machines and electronics. Instead, you have to understand machines and electronics by understanding the essence of technology. And what the essence of technology turns out to be is something that machine technology like ChatGPT and genetic engineering, the various ways in which we've come up with to intervene directly on the human genome and the genome of all organisms. These are just like when you look at a mountain and you see, like I live right at the foothills of the Sandia Mountains, and you look at the mountains, there's like distinctive rock formations that really say Sandias to you or whatever the mountain is. And the way in which a particular rock formation suggests the mountains as a whole, that's his view of how contemporary technologies reflect the essence of technology. So they're just kind of like a paradigmatic or exemplary expression of something that helps us understand it, but they're not co-equal to it. It's deeper than them. It preceded them historically and enabled their development. So what I show in the book, and it's about 10 pages of the book is out of 60 something, is that there's sort of three different meanings of the essence of technology. One of them is that the essence of technology is nothing technological. And that's a kind of like ground clearing point about don't think I'm looking at a bunch of technological devices and inductively abstracting their essence from that, because A, that's circular, and because you have to know what technology is to know what the technological devices that you're looking at to abstract away their essence is. And B, he thinks technology precedes technological devices. So the second understanding of the essence of technology turns out to be metaphysics. So he says the essence of technology is identical to the essence of contemporary modern metaphysics, which I show means he ends up distinguishing two epochs in the modern age. So there's early modern and late modern. The early modern is what he'll end up calling subjectivism, and that's the subject-object dichotomy and the understanding of all things as either thinking subjects or external objects, external to subjectivity. And then the view that all value and meaning comes from us. We subjects posit values onto things or project or invest things with value. Things, objects themselves are inherently valueless. The fact-value dichotomy follows from the subject-object dichotomy. And that's part of what he thinks this is partly responsible for the nihilism of the contemporary world, the meaninglessness of things, is that we think all the meaning of everything comes from us. And if that's true, then we could just take it back. So everything ends up becoming very fragile and has no weight on us. And so that's the first sense of the second essence of technology is early modern metaphysics. The second sense of the second essence of technology is late modern metaphysics, and that's that a important transition happens between Kant and Nietzsche. So in Heidegger's view, Kant is thinking Descartes' unthought. Descartes' the one who turns us into subjects by showing us that we have this certainty of our own consciousness that we don't have of anything else. So that because the consciousness becomes the center of the universe, basically. But in Nietzsche, you get a thinking of the unthought of Kant, which is this idea that God is dead, which Heidegger takes to mean like the physical and the metaphysical have been pulled apart. We finite beings can't reach to a beyond outside this finite world to ground this world in. So the traditional metaphysical project of wanting to find the ultimate foundation of things, in fact, wanting to find two different ultimate foundations, an innermost core, that's the ontological, and then outermost perspective, that's the theological, and then link those together. His view, that's what metaphysics has been since at least Plato, and I trace it back to Thales and the student Anaximander. So that's to say metaphysics is ontotheology. And in the late modern, the Nietzschean age that we're in, and that Heidegger's trying to think the unthought of to help us move beyond modernity into what he calls the other beginning, what is literally the postmodern, is in the Nietzschean age, we understand all things, he thinks, as eternally recurring will to power. So the essence of all things, the tiniest component out of which everything is made, is will to power. That means everything is nothing but force striving against force to keep force in force for as long as possible. And then if you zoom out and ask, like, what shape does the universe that's driven by the engine of will to power take? The answer is eternal return, or like a river of becoming flowing endlessly in a circle. So this idea that we have these kind of ontological lenses on, that we understand what it means to be as eternally recurring will to power, or as nothing but force striving against force to keep force in force as long as possible, is what he calls enframing. That's the technological understanding of being that turns everything into a resource to be optimized. That is, when we understand everything is just force striving against force, we tend to relate to everything as meaningless stuff, to be put on standby, to be put into the what he calls the standing reserve, to be optimized as efficiently as possible. So we're not just treating the external world that way, the way we did in the early modern world, where we reduce everything to stockpiles of objects. We're even treating ourselves that way. This was sort of coming out of his critique of genetic engineering and seeing what was happening with biology's ability to start transforming the human genome, and his worries about whether we might end up accidentally or deliberately transforming the very nature of what it meant to be human in a way that would kind of trap us in this age that we're in, something that's never happened historically every age has given rise to another. And let me just say, because I flagged it in my mind earlier, that I still say in my mind. That's a very Cartesian thought, but anyway, I thought of it earlier, which is that it's confusing to people to talk about things having multiple essences, because we tend to think of the essence, since Plato, as what permanently endures, right? Like the essence of a circle is the perfect form of a circle, and all the circles in the world are just imperfect instantiations of the form of a circle. But for Heidegger, we have to understand essence not in that way as what permanently endures, but instead as a kind of a verbal essencing, unfolding and transforming through time. So for him, the essence of, and this is to reject the thinking of essence from Plato through Kripke, basically, and replace it with a much more historical understanding of essence, which I think Hegel is the one who paves the way for this historicization of nature, where what it means to be Goethe before him, but what it means to be something, to understand it, you can't just look for its fixed genetic core or something. But in Goethe, you got to trace the life cycle of the plant through its emergence, blossoming, and decay to understand unchanging, fixed nature.
I'm doing a series of my own starting soon on Charles Taylor's The Language Animal. And I'm going through the sources of it because I don't think anyone wants to hear just my random opinion on Charles Taylor. I thought it'd be helpful to kind of go through the background of it. And I'm reading Herder and Humboldt. So when you talk about the historical, the historical nature, yeah, I was this is very familiar. Yeah.
And they're both very important for Heidegger. Herder is sort of Charles calls him a romantic expressivist. And it's the view that basically language expresses individuals' ways of understanding their reality. And then when that catches on, when you come up with a way of putting something that other people find insightful or useful, they take it over. And so languages are built up in a way to reflect the people who use them's insights into the nature of things, which means that different languages preserve quite different ways of being in the world. And that's, this is part of what people often ask, why did Heidegger become a Nazi? Well, the Nazis were national socialists. So this idea of being a socialist, but nationalist at the same time, meaning not think that we could get rid of the languages and have Esperanto or something like some of the positivists thought, but instead preserve the unique insights of German and French and English and all these other languages, was part of the Herderian romantic inheritance. It's not great and it's terrible. It's here. It sounds right wing, I think, in the contemporary context where the left tends to be cosmopolitan, but in New Mexico, where we're trying to preserve Native American languages, so that speakers of Dina, the Navajo language, for example, are there's fewer and fewer of them with each generation. It gets into AI, but I still preserve the language. These are not right wing issues, though. They're fascinating because it's part of the reason Dina has done comparatively well is the role it played as code talker too, giving us this uncrackable code, because the Germans and the Japanese had no access to the language of the Navajo people. It split off from other languages long enough ago that they couldn't algorithm it and figure it out.
Yeah. And you were talking to, it's such a tension I feel reading Herder and Humboldt. I know I'm saying I'm trying to, I forget the German, you know,
Yeah,
I got to
sure,
work on my
right.
German, right?
Umbut.
Um,
Yes.
yeah. Is the tension
Also
between,
very
like, on the
important.
one hand,
Yeah.
there's this beautiful recognition of the beauty of each individual culture. And then all of a sudden, like right alongside that will be like the most like, oh, classic 19th century, just like brutal colonizing thought. Like, okay, you know, like, okay, how do we separate these two? Because I know these are in tension, right? But
Historicity is real. I have to tell this to my some of my
yeah,
students.
yes.
Like things really change. Things have
Yeah.
dramatically changed in a relatively short, and that's pretty obvious now when you think about technologies, but still people are less aware of it when you think about like gender norms and like what it meant to be a man. And there's like a lot of things that have transformed dramatically in a relatively short period of time, and that has led to various reactions, right? Where people get anxious about like there not being a correct answer. Let's come back to that. But yeah, Humboldt's super interesting too, because in that first book, I talk a fair amount about him because Heidegger's thinking about what it means to be in a university and what the meaning of a university is. And essentially, the university was a German invention that was established as an alternative to the French model. And they were trying to figure out what it would mean to teach in a way that integrated teaching with contemporary research. So, before that, they'd been separated. There were like research academies and then places where you would learn the fixed doctrines about reality, which for a long time we thought we were close to finishing and like, putting the final period on. And then when we had some serious breakthroughs, we realized that we were nowhere close. And so this question of how do you keep a university unified as all these different sciences are branching out and getting ever further apart in their specializations, that was the big question that Heidegger was engaged in 1934 as the rector of Freiburg University. How do you unify? What's the uni of the university? I tell that story in the first book. This Heidegger on theology. Just have a hard time, but that's still I think the most influential book because I get into this stuff about education that I have been interested in my whole life, and I'm still working on, especially in this text in the context of AI and cheating, things that I hear
Yeah.
a lot.
It's really interesting, continually in my own study, the connection between if you have a real emphasis on the historical and on historicity in your thought, you're going to be really, you're going to have to make a serious place for pedagogy, right? Like the two end up intersecting a lot. That makes total sense to me.
Yeah, say more about that. That's interesting.
Sorry, I missed that last part.
I said, say more about that. That's interesting. So,
Say more.
yeah,
Well,
like you think, yeah,
yeah.
I'm going to interview
My
you for a while.
background's more my background's more in like Gadamer and Ricoeur. So when you talk about, I mean, I still think I've heard a lot of different critiques of Descartes, but the best one I've heard is the one that Gadamer used from Vico, and especially having jumped from 2 to 5 kids. It's like the Cartesian system does not work with children. I think is the most condemning critique there is, because if you can't give it to the next generation, then it doesn't actually work. Like,
Interesting.
so yeah, that's Vico's 50 years after, or maybe a little more after Descartes is writing. Maybe it's I think I got the numbers wrong. Whatever. I think it's 1500s and 1600s for Vico. You have him writing and saying like, you have to have ethics. You have to teach kids how to behave properly, and you have to teach them proper methods for study before you break everything down into its tiniest particles and build it back up. Which is, in some ways leads us back to the technology circle, the inframing circle, right? Like,
right. Yeah. Like I would say, there were modern thinkers who tried to have a completely rationalistic system of ethics. Spinoza. There's people who try to kind of start from a semi-Cartesian axiomatic point and then generate out. And Kant is the most famous, but he's starting with
right.
the subject. You just call that the rational agent, and then say ethics is about only acting on those maxims that every other rational agent can act on without contradiction. And politics is about protecting the sphere of every rational agent to pursue their interests insofar as they don't step on the toes of all the other rational agents trying to do the same thing. That's basically the foundations of Western liberal democracy. So these are, very influential and important ideas. The Heideggerian critique, and Gadamer was a student of Heidegger. I haven't really thought much about the Vico stuff, so that's interesting. But the Heideggerian critique that Gadamer was learning from Heidegger was that, and this is connected to the AI stuff, is that think about like riding a bike. When you're riding a bike, you're not or doing anything you're good at skillfully. You're not like a subject standing over an external object apart from you, right? The bike you're riding or the book you're reading, whatever you're doing, is an integral part of the self-world unity that you are. That intertwinement of self and world, that skillful embodiment that Dasein is, that our being here is, as an intelligible being, is not something that you can build up starting with Cartesian subjectivity. But part of Dreyfus's critique of good old-fashioned AI, that sort of rule-following AI, where they're trying to build AIs by just filling a system with rules to follow, was that will never get there because expert human agents aren't following rules. They're learning this embodied responsiveness to complicated and ever-changing, open-ended situations that for which this does intersect with some crypty things. There's no rule that can tell you get an infinite regress of rules basically that you would need. So the AIs can win, in the finite domains like chess and Go, and maybe it's interesting, maybe in things like a city or car, or specific, like a job site for a self-driving tractor, that kind of thing. But when something unexpected happens that they haven't been trained on, they're still just listening to a Wired podcast this morning about one of their experts riding in the latest generation AI cars and telling the story of like in the car, it was much better than when they were first stopping all the time, for the wrong reasons. But like a dog was running toward the road and there was a fence there to keep it from being able to run the road, but the AI couldn't recognize that dog won't be able to run in front of me because there's a fence. So it like slams on the brakes. So you're going along riding in the AI car peacefully and then boom, dead stop. So, and the person who was doing the podcast said, if there had been a car behind us, they would hit us from behind. You as a human driver would probably slow down a little more slowly, knowing that other humans don't have instantaneous reflexes. And you've seen videos like this on the internet where like the self-driving car overreacts to the human obstacle and causes an accident. So it's still interesting to see, they're getting better, but will they ever get better than 70% generously of like expert level human agents? That's an interesting question.
Well, I do think there is something there about like but will they be better than the bottom 30% of human drivers? And
they already are. They already are. So that's why that's why it's catching on. Yeah, because like traffic is largely just a magnified effect of small errors. The person who slows down on the turn on the freeway when there's no reason to slow down, and the car behind them slows down a tiny bit more, and you get this echo, amplifying echo that leads to a standstill on the freeway. So, but AIs don't do that. So you don't get that. So they're more efficient. They get you. But then there are the situations when some unexpected thing happens, an emergency vehicle trying to come through, whatever it is that they haven't yet been trained on. And or there's a funny one. I remember seeing a video of the two self-driving robo-taxis where they were waiting for each other, and one of them's trying to go around a car that's double parked, and the other one's coming at it. And it's sticking out, so one coming at it can't go, and it can't go because the other one's sticking out, and they're just backing up. And all the robo-taxis are backing up behind them. And people start videoing it like, what's it going to do? It's a kind of fascinating puzzle. Yeah, but as you say, I mean, people always think their states are the worst drivers. I saw something that claimed that New Mexico genuinely was. And coming from California, which had like fast but angry drivers who shoot each other when you don't use your turn signal. Back in the 90s when I was there, here the problem was people getting onto the freeway going like 35 miles an hour. And like it was like over cautious, slow bad drivers instead of like very fast 18-year-olds with no sense of their own mortality, like developing their skills actually, and sometimes with disastrous consequences. But we do have that.
I haven't done a lot of driving out in California, but I will say I just drove in Boston. I took my family up there to have the kids see snow for the first time. And I lived in Chicago for a while. And I will say, I think Florida, Orlando is worse. And it's the combination of you have actually a large immigrant population from Colombia and Brazil, and they have different driving laws. So it's like they behave differently than you would expect, right? Like you have some people have
Charles
like
Taylor,
American,
the herder problem. There's a culture,
it's very much
like think of like Italy. What are lanes?
Yes,
lanes are inefficient.
And right along with that, though. Yeah, but then right along with that are the tourists. Like, so I mean, I would be driving down I-4, which I think actually just the last couple of years was the most dangerous highway in the United States. And I would be going home. It's a 10-minute drive, if no one's being crazy, but it's where Disney is. And like all of a sudden, almost every day, someone would cut across all 5 lanes of traffic to get to the exit. And there's just like, you don't have that experience in a lot of places where it's all of a sudden like a common people are like, oh, I don't know where I am. I'm on vacation. And so you just mix it all together. And I'm curious. I've heard terrible things about LA. So I don't know, I haven't been able to compare
LA's terrible because it's bottleneck traffic. So there's so many people trying to get places that there's like rush hour traffic 8 hours a day. So I think that's the problem. It's a car culture, and there's so many people. The right has demonized California, but I don't think anyone's voluntarily leaving California. It's actually a great place to live, but some of the downsides are traffic.
Yeah, well, a lot of people live there.
Yeah, exactly. They want to live there. And LA's beautiful and interesting, and there's tons of like creative, artistic stuff going on. My brother lives there, so I'm there. But it's
okay.
It's also the one place I've crashed a car in my whole life. Was in
okay, that might be a small strike.
Yeah, but I fell asleep.
Oh, okay.
I was doing like an 8-hour drive, and I hadn't gotten coffee yet.
Oh,
but yeah, that was another story. But I woke up and had long enough to decide which car that was dead stopped as I was going 60 to smash into, and it turned out I rear-ended a priest, which is probably karmic justice. But he was
well, we're glad you're safe. Yeah.
yeah. Me too. I'm glad everyone was okay.
Yeah. I did want to ask, returning, I think to you talked about the nothing technological, just kind of removing. It's like, okay, we're not going to have this circular definition. Talking about Heidegger's, and then we had the metaphysical one, and then we had the will to power one, if I heard you correctly on that. And then for the will to power one, is that connected to is that connected to Heidegger's concept of at hand? The idea of just like it's always at our disposal instead of like existing in itself?
They're connected in a complicated way. So you're thinking of the Vorhandenheit, I would call the at hand, and the Zuhandenheit, I would call the on hand. So there's the equipmental, as McQuarrie and Robinson translate it, and then the present at hand and ready to hand, basically, is the McQuarrie and Robinson. One of them is the skillful, engaged mode of coping with things that you're good at, like using hammers when you're hammering, pens when you're writing with them, cars when you're driving them, not crashing them. And the other is the disengaged, thematizing, objectifying relation you have to stuff that you're not in that skillful, engaged mode with, and that's the present. And in his view, Descartes gives us an ontology of the present at hand, subject-object divide, and the representational commerce between subjects and objects. But you can't build the ready to hand, the Zuhandenheit, out of the present at hand, Vorhandenheit. You can't build can't get at what it's like to ride a bicycle by staring at a bicycle as an object with properties. You can't build that back up out of it. So, but you can go the other way and get from riding a bike skillfully to what it's like to stare at a bike with properties. So that's the Being in Time story. The first half of Being in Time is this critique of Cartesian dualism and the ontology of modernity that's embodied in that. Later Heidegger is dramatically different than early Heidegger, and precisely because he historicizes ontology. That's the history of being, and says, rather than claiming that the equipmental mode of relating to things, the ready to hand, zu handen, is what philosophy has always forgotten. This is the view that Pippin tells in his culmination book. He was my teacher my first year in grad school. And it's a story that Tom Sheehan tells. That's what Pippin's getting. As if the forgottenness of being in later Heidegger was like the forgottenness of the ready to hand. That's not Heidegger's view. Heidegger's view later is that to forget being means that the entire metaphysical tradition has understood what it means to be in an epochal succession of at least three different ways. The pre-Socratic, there's the ancient, the medieval, and the modern, basically. Three different ages. And the ontology presented in Being in Time, in the first division, the ontology of the ready to hand, is itself needing to be situated within the history of being. If you do that, if you say, how would later Heidegger situate this understanding of all things as fully showing their being when we're using them skillfully? How would he understand that later in the history of being? The answer, I think, is he would understand it as sort of the penultimate step on the way to nihilism, because it's in a way worse than subjects and objects, because now stuff is nothing but what we use it for. And you can complicate this story, but he says things in Being in Time like the forest is nothing but a timber, the mountain is like a stockpile of rock and all this stuff. So he's got a very un-environmentalist view. I mean, Heidegger's a very famously influential figure for environmental ethics, but that's later Heidegger, not early Heidegger. So the later Heidegger's view is when we forget being, we're forgetting something like the condition of possibility, or the phenomenon, the source that all the different metaphysical understandings of being were made possible by, but that none of them exhaustively captured in their metaphysical frameworks. So it's complicated, but the very last stage in the history of being that we're in is the late modern, and that's the Nietzschean one that understands being, or isness, what it means to be anything at all, as nothing but eternally recurring will to power, and thus reduces all things to Bestand, meaningless resources standing by to be efficiently optimized. And that view, that's the technological, what he calls the technological. He does, as I mentioned, but never fully explained, never explained at all, I think. There's a third understanding of the essence of being, which for him is the most crucial and the key to developing a free relation to technology, so we can use it without being used by it. Not a Unabomber guy who thinks we should give up technology but live in the woods. Go back to outhouses. He's got a view that we have to see the historical danger of technology, the drift, the current that it's pushing us in. It's not neutral. The idea that technology is one of the things he critiques. Guns aren't neutral. They don't make good paperweights. They're not good toys for your kids. They're very good at shooting people and things, right? They're made for purposes. So anyway, but technology itself is not neutral. It pushes us, as a dramatic expression of this technological understanding of being, it pushes us toward this reduction of all things to meaningless resources to be optimized. And insofar as we understand everything we deal with, and ourselves increasingly as nothing but meaningless things to be optimized, we find ourselves living lives that don't matter to us. Like, that's nihilism. Things become less and less meaningful. We're increasingly dissatisfied with life. And I think we see that all around us. The weaponized nihilism of school shootings, just this expression of despair at the state of the world. And I think there's a lot, we can trace a lot of stuff back to this. I'm a firm believer that nihilism is the problem. On the internet today, there's a lot of people who want to call themselves nihilists. and think it's cool,
Yeah.
but it's, if nihilism in its original sense in Nietzsche and Heidegger, they mean different things. In both cases, it's like life doesn't matter, stop mattering. And you might think, well, that's great. You could be bad emo and say, that's great because that means I have this incredible lightness. I can do anything I want. Okay, but anything you want stops mattering to you after a while, and it's not. It doesn't make your life feel like it has any importance. That's the problem. So this technological understanding of being, he then thinks, for us to get out of it, we have to understand it, understand the drift, the historical direction it's pushing us in. And that gives us kind of prophetic crystal ball to be able to understand where technology is moving. That's part of the reason we still read this old Nazi, 50 years later, is that his critique of technology was very prescient. Did powerfully anticipate the developments that we're only seeing now, that couldn't possibly literally predict it, but was getting at by reading how metaphysics isn't just some abstruse concern of philosophers in their ivory tower. It's the history that we are, because what I call ontological holism. Everything is. So if you transform our understanding of what isness is, what it means to be, you set off a transformation in everything. That's what metaphysics does. It stabilizes an age's understanding of what it means to be. So when a new metaphysics takes shape and begins transforming its age, you can predict to some degree what the direction things are going to move in. And that's what Heidegger's doing. He's reading Nietzsche like a crystal ball of the direction things are moving.
Yeah,
but the deepest essence of technology stuff we can get into if you want, and it's important. But that's what Gadamer himself and Vadimo talk about. Like, they could never understand. It was this idea that inframing is the photographic negative of a known. Where the danger is, the saving power also grows. This stuff that's this crucial gestalt switch we have to make to be saved. But the very thing that endangers us can save us if we understand it the right way. That is his view, and I try and explain that in the book. And I've tried to explain it in the one book back was the Heidegger Art and Postmodernity, which was articulating this view of his understanding of art and showing how that was crucial to his positive vision of how we understand being in a postmodern, how we get out of and beyond late modern nihilism of technological framing and what that means. A lot of people think he's this quietistic figure who's waiting for another god to come and save us. It's all confused. But he thinks the postmodern understanding arrived a couple centuries ago with Van Gogh and Hölderlin and all these. Once we understand it, we can ourselves begin to live more meaningful lives more full of meaning. Basically cultivating and developing practices that encourage rather than dissipate that can help us build better lives and worlds, future more meaningful to us.
Yeah, if I could, I've said it on here before. If I could just make a quick comment, I'm in Central Florida, so if you bring up guns and you talk about the instrument like that, it has a purpose to it. People get really, it's Central Florida, so they're like, defensive. "What are you talking about?" But I've never had anyone do. Another example that's less emotionally charged.
My students do too, by the way. Yeah, it's not just Florida. There's a lot of hunters. And I acknowledge that guns are cool. They're cool devices, But they're not neutral.
I've watched
I'm not
Clint Eastwood. Yeah.
Yeah.
No,
man. I get it.
Yeah.
But I'm not going to wear one as a hat.
Right. Well, and that's the example I always, especially in Central Florida, though, is I use is like, there's a huge difference between if you drive a van and if you drive a truck. Yeah. And this, like, they have different purposes, and this because if you drive a truck, you will get asked to help with things, right? Like, it's just built into, like, and people are like, "Oh, you're right, it's not neutral." I'm like, no, it's really not. Yeah. So just another example of what you're talking about.
Is that the analogy between like a pistol and an AK-47 or something?
Yeah, like a hunting rifle and like a You're like, is that really a hunting rifle? I don't think so. But
Well,
Oh
and
man.
the logic of enframing pushes us toward more efficient and optimal weapons. And there's different ways
Right.
of understanding that. One way of understanding that is like non-lethal weaponry. There's stores opening here in Albuquerque about non-lethal weapons. And, the military's looked at things like laser weapons that would blind the enemy. Let's take away their capacity to fight. But they rejected that because of a ableism built into the idea that actually blinding them is worse than killing them. That it may be better to be dead. This is too cruel. But some of the technologies have been used, in the military because we have put so much money in the military and they have more technology than they can use. They pass that down to the police. So you've had this militarization of police, and the police use a lot of these non-lethal technologies on protesters. And getting shot with a rubber bullet is unlikely to kill you, but it's going to take you out of the protest and the future
Yeah.
protests. And if it hits you in the eye or something, you're really in trouble.
Oh well.
And then there's
Yeah. I mean, that's the
water cannons and glue. Like there's all sorts of fascinating, all the forms of gases, non-lethal, but if you're asthmatic like me, terrifying.
Oh, yeah. And I mean, that's and that's the part of the enframing too, is that it shaves off the rough edges and it doesn't address the individual cases, right? It's like,
Right.
well, it wasn't supposed to be lethal.
Yeah.
Right. And they're like, I can't be held responsible because it wasn't supposed to be lethal. And it's like, you could have thought of that. Like,
that's right. And I can't be held responsible is that makes sense in the military, right? Like, but thank God, that Russian submarine pilot, the second in command guy, was supposed to turn the key to obey the captain's orders and launch the missiles when they thought the U.S. was attacking. Didn't do it, or we would all be gone. So it is an interesting thing that the disobedience to the chain of command, which is totally irrational, and they go very far to try and eliminate in well-trained troops, right? Has occasionally people have gone against it nonetheless. We'll see what happens. This is part of it's going on today because there's a lot of people being fired who could be those brakes on the system, and that makes some of us nervous about what's coming next. That after the brakes on the car are taken out, what are they going to point it toward at high speed?
As a kind of a concrete example, as you talk about the will to power and the eternal return of the will to power, I've had a lot of people to talk about the medical industry and the food industry, and I mean, you could pretty much go down the line, but those two in particular, and the way that the switch to responsibility to the shareholder completely changes the product because it is seen purely as commodity and its value is transferred to the dollar, rather, like, for instance, its use as food or its use as medicine for health. Is that a good example of what we're talking about?
It sounds like it. It's not one I've studied in detail. I'm looking largely at the development of AI, so-called.
Right.
You can see it there too, because you get, when OpenAI, this San Francisco company that was co-founded by Elon Musk and others, so he left when they started making dramatic breakthroughs and wouldn't let him run the company, and took his money with him. And they had a small crisis till one of the big breakthroughs was self-coding machines, machines that could write computer codes that could write computer code, and that let them then branch off to Microsoft, which more than replenished the funding they'd lost when Elon went home and took his ball with him. So it's, but their founding mission, and they're almost religious in their commitment to this mission, and there's lots of true believers, technophiles, who are deeply believe in this mission. It was to safely create a true AI. They call it AGI, artificial general intelligence, and those terms are somewhat controversial and getting used in different ways. But they mean like an artificial super intelligence. They'll be able to save humanity. So they were, looking for only another God can save us. They thought like they could create a kind of artificial God that would be able to save humanity from the entrenched problems that we haven't been able to figure out solutions to. And I go through a lot of the details in the book, and they're fascinating and interesting. But now there has been like a deflation of what AGI, or general artificial intelligence, or artificial general intelligence means. Like, it meant originally, instead of it just being good in one area, it being good in a bunch of different areas, and generally intelligent. And then there's super intelligent, would be even smarter than us in a bunch of different ways. And the claim now is that basically anything that can pass the Turing test online. The Turing test, as popularly understood, was in order to get rid of our anthropomorphic projections, for us to be able to say that an AI has genuinely become intelligent. If we can't tell if we're interacting with a human or a computer, then it passes. And ChatGPT can pass that. And to some people, at least, there's people who believe that they're interacting with a genuine intelligence. And now, when Musk goes in and fires tens of thousands of people and replaces them with AI, that's what they're calling AGI. So they're saying that this a true artificial intelligence is there now to do the jobs that these humans were doing a month ago. So that's a real thing that's really happening right now. And those things are not really that good. They're at best 70%. That's a generous assessment, is that they're 70% as good as a human would be in the same role. And that's probably more like 60%. But they're generously 70% as good. That means they're better than the bad humans, like the terrible humans get on the phone and drives you nuts, right? But they're worse than the good ones that are usually the ones who end up resolving the problem that you have to keep calling back until you finally get the good one. So now the good person's gone, right? How this will all play out is going to be, I think, very problematic and lead to immense frustration that will probably end up rebuilding the bureaucracy eventually that they're trying to do. It'll be hard because they're selling the buildings, right? They're not just dismantling the bureaucracies. They're trying to sell the buildings that the bureaucracies are in. They're trying to make it as hard as possible for the system to be rebuilt, undoing, which is a very unconservative thing. But Matthew Arnold, the great conservative thinker, is basically you can reduce conservatism down to if it's not broke, don't fix it. Like, there's a wisdom embodied in the past that you disrespect to your peril. You should change the system the way a doctor would operate on their father, very carefully. Just go in there and start working on multiple organs if they haven't. Not broke, don't fix it. This is different. This is like this is much more the far right and the far left are agreeing in a kind of revolutionary ethos. Let's destroy this thing and replace it with something better. Or better is arguably worse, but AI is central to this vision, and it's about why would we pay humans when we could have a computer do the same job or 70% of the same job for 10% or 5% of the money. It's inefficient, it's irrational, it does not compute from a CEO's perspective. You were saying that in the medical industry, and I would say in general that's the problem. Is we allow this kind of CEOification of the university, of government, of all our public institutions, then we are subject to the dictates that whatever gets the most for the least. That's what I call the optimization imperative of technology. Get the most for the least. Whatever gets the most for the least wins. And that's a formula for meaninglessness and dissatisfaction. It makes sense in certain narrow technological domains, but when you apply that to important things in life, it ends up, imagine thinking, with my children, I'm going to try and get the most for the least. I'll spend the least amount of time with them, but make sure that when I do, we're doing I'm reading to them, helping them learn to read or something. There's parents doing this kind of thing. It's a way to not really develop a good, loving connection to your children. It's not a good philosophy for having a meaningful life. It's a good philosophy for maximizing your income portfolio or something. But it's, as you say, when you apply these what I call the optimization imperative outside the domain in which it really makes sense, which is what technological framing does, it ends up systematically eroding the meaningfulness of these practices that we've had. So part of this, I was talking to my friend B. Scott Rouse, who's the punk rock drummer in Oakland, and he's a Dreyfus student and a philosophy PhD. And he's working now. He just got hired to work full time on AI, and we're going to have to develop new practices for thinking about how to use these technologies in ways that are not subject to the technologizing, nihilistic imperative of getting the most from least. Rather, how do we use ChatGPT to help us cultivate and develop our sense of what's really there, independent of our will and important. And I do that in some degree in the book. I try and show various ways in which we already do that I think is important to realize, and then we can developing new ways to do that in all these different fields. And I know people are doing this, the cutting edge people in music and writing. There's a lot of people using AI, for example, in collaborative ways and thinking about it, trying to develop it and refine it in ways that will help use it without being used by it, to avoid the fate that I go through our fear of, just becoming tools of our tools, like Terminator, Matrix,
right?
Scenarios.
If you don't mind me asking, I want to be respectful of your time, but can you give me like a concrete example? You mentioned a little bit about musicians using it, but like, what's an example of someone using AI in an technologizing way? Which I think for most people, that sounds like an oxymoron, right? Because they're like, AI is technology, which of course is what the first part of our conversation was about. So, what would be an anti-technologizing? I need to work on that word. Way to use AI.
My brain instantly fills with examples, so I have to pick one. But the one that I did in the book was using AI to try and understand AI. And you're limited by the fact that AI has like a ceiling. It can't do anything better than what it's trained on. In fact, it's probably never going to be as good as what it's trained on. People think it's like it won't be any better. I think it's probably not going to be as good. And what it's trained on is, growing and could be better. But people worry that it'll start getting trained on its own output, reaching the plateau that way. I think there's good reasons to think that's overly optimistic. But that's not, because there's so much more human stuff to be trained on. Like Cambridge University is encouraging all of us to sign things allowing the AIs to train on their work, which would make it better. But also, AI is like a plagiarism. It takes everything away from. It will say like if it's trained on my work, and then someone asks it, what does Heidegger mean by what does Heidegger thinks wrong with technology? It'll say Heidegger thinks technology, it reflects the biases built into the metaphysics of our age. Specifically, our Nietzschean ontotheology reduces everything to eternally recurring power, will to power. When you reduce everything to nothing but forces competing with forces, you get a view of everything as meaningless stuff waiting to be optimized. That was me. I could, that's 30 years of work.
Yeah.
But it will just push that out as, the truth, which like there's a sort of a weird non-capitalistic, death of the author view in which you should go, great. That's increasing the pool of knowledge, right? On the other hand, I also live in this capitalist economy and would like a little bit of recognition for my life's work. So it's an interesting puzzle. But that's an example. I think we have other examples, like you're doing it right now, using some pretty advanced technologies to try and better disclose and disseminate your sense of what matters and what's significant to you, right? Why do you focus on this topic rather than another? Every time somebody writes a paper, they're using like word processing software that wasn't available to the Heideggers and the Kants and the Descartes to organize and develop their thoughts about what matter to them in the text that they're reading and the issues that affect them and that they care the most about. Think of like using cutting edge you got kids, right? To think about like the advances in child safety in your cars and this kind of thing. And even just the self-driving cars being safer in general, even if like the accidents are terrifying and terrible. But in general, right, it looks likely that they will bring down traffic fatalities and it'll be interesting to see if like here we have like a real racer culture where these guys love to old guys, and mostly guys. They go 150 miles an hour down the road, and they're on the back wheel of their motorcycles and stuff. Will that culture be able to survive a culture in which self-driving cars? And I suspect yes, because America is so car-centric. There'll always be people keeping around the old technologies. And so who knows? Will it be rich? Will it be poor? So there's lots of ways in which we use we use technologies without being used by them. But the danger is that if you don't think about it, like, so you're a student in like a freshman. I spoke the first time I gave this, what became this book, as a talk was at Franklin and Marshall College, where my friend Stefan Koifer generously invited me. And I was speaking with, they're a wealthy private school. They're not like super Ivy League, so they attract, a lot of students who are paying full tuition from other countries who are maybe couldn't get into the Harvards and Princetons and Yales and stuff, but are still paying a lot of money. But English isn't their first language. So when they are engaging with ChatGPT, it looks extremely good, right? Like the level of the writing that's coming out of ChatGPT or its ilk. I don't just mean the Gemini, whatever. But ChatGPT is the one I use the most, so I have the most experience with. They have a sense that this is so good. I'm here and it's here, right? Whereas when you get really good at writing, you can see that you're here and it's here. But it takes a lot of hard work. Like, think of being a driver. You're a bad driver. Those self-driving cars are here. Once you're a good driver, they're here. And I think this is this general problem that, the danger isn't that it's going to become this super intelligent thing that either saves or destroys us. I think those are, on the biggest scale, those are thanatological fantasies, displaced religious views. The real problem is that we might get used to its level and lower expectations, not just about it, but about us to that level. So we'll be perfectly happy being writers who never get beyond this point because we can use ChatGPT or whatever to be a little bit better. And that's fine. That's good enough. That's like the good enough philosophy. You'd be a good enough writer to like do okay in school. And that might be fine if you're going to go and be an engineer or somebody who doesn't care that much about writing. But if you care about writing and like this composition of the soul and this transformation of the self and these basically deep philosophical themes, that's alarming and dissatisfying. Yeah. And I will say, though, I dismiss, the fear of AI takeover, and I trace the history of that and stuff. There are real fields, like think of all the people getting we mentioned this briefly earlier, but when we were talking before about people just getting the notice that they're fired from an AI in the mail. There's people losing their jobs to this stuff right now, and it's not just truck drivers and taxi drivers. It's people who had the American dream jobs. They worked hard, did well in school, they got a good high-paying job with health insurance and retirement, and they were raising families in Washington and other expensive metropolitan cities, and now all of a sudden they have no job. This can be a kind of devastating destruction of your life, in a way that AI and like these visions of dystopia kind of you can take as a metaphorical or symbolic representation of it. So I don't think we're really going to get the super intelligent AIs. I don't think we're anywhere near that because I talk about this in the book, but there's two of the three people who came up with the deep learning algorithm that was responsible for the later, that led to the advances that were in large language models and in self-driving cars. They got the Turing Award, which was like the Nobel Prize for computer science, but then they also got the Nobel Prize in physics this year. So these are very, highly recognized people. And two of them are worried that basically human life the end is nigh. Jeffrey Hinton, who's the most outspoken of the three, he was the head computer scientist for Google. He said, enjoy your life now because you might not have much time left. Basically, like kiss your ass goodbye. Enjoy these last few years of human reign. And I deconstruct that and show that he doesn't quite know what he's talking about because as a super smart math guy, he sees even smarter math-like computer things and sees himself being replaced. But really, they lack something very fundamental to what what's led to human-like intelligence, and that's caring about things mattering to us. Nothing matters to them. They don't care about it. So there's no, as I say in the book, they're not a Dasein. There's nothing that it's like to be a large language model. They don't have a world, and they're not a Dasein. My friend was saying something, and I jokingly said, well, maybe my feminist friend, I said, well, maybe they're a Masein. And then I thought, well, maybe if they're like a gaping Masein, they have a gaping absence where a self should be. And it's that gaping when you interact with them for a long time. I think part of the anxiety people have and that people have written about is that you interact with this thing that's like this kind of amazing know-it-all that's 70% good about everything. You can ask it about, and is completely ignorant of its own ignorance and all this. You get this sense of like, I've never interacted with something like this that wasn't a person, where there wasn't a world on the other side of this. But this is one. This is the Chalmerian zombie, that there's nothing that it's like to be it. And that's a very uncanny thing. It knocks you out of the world that you've been used to. So I think out of that reaction to this haunting sense that there's no there when you're interacting with them, people have overcompensated and projected a kind of intelligence and world onto these things that are really, souped up information delivery and prediction machines. And I go through some examples of both really, to me, impressive things that they've done and really kind of amusingly terrible things that they've done. I have a dark sense of humor, so they're more amusing to me than to the people they have. They're wild stuff. So, and I find, these topics are, my students are really interested in it. I think if you're a student and nobody tells you, education is a chance to really transform your soul, as Plato said, to like discover your talents and skills, what you're really good at, what makes you distinctive as an individual, and develop that in a way that lets you contribute to what you care about in the world and thereby live a meaningful life. If somebody says that's what education is, if somebody says that to you, that can help, because otherwise we're raised in this optimization imperative where under the technological framing that we're all in, everything's just about getting the most for the least. So we think of education as like just one more place to try and get the most for the least. So of course I should turn in like a ChatGPT paper if that's less work and can get me a satisfying grade than doing the hard work myself. But doing that means, that you miss the chance, if you don't use it in the right way, to cultivate and develop the essential traits and capacities that make you the person that you are, and that will enable you to actually engage with the world in a way that would allow you to have a life that you experience as meaningful. So I think awareness, education in the sense of like, let's understand historically where we are. We're in this technological age, and here's its dangers. We've only scratched the surface of those here, but and then we can start thinking about how to use it in ways that don't just get caught up in that. First of all, don't just get caught up in that. And then second of all, help us envision more liberating possibilities on the far side of it.
Yeah. Dr. Thomson, I want to be respectful of your time. So I appreciate you coming in today. I appreciate you talking through this. Absolutely fascinating. So much to think about. Really appreciate you coming on today.
Thanks, PJ, and thanks for having me.